My friend Ed Hill, colleague back at People Incorporated, where I work in Fall River, he pointed out the day after Dr. Wolfensberger passed away, Ed said something, I thought it was pretty insightful actually, that many of the people whose lives have been most affected by Dr. Wolfensberger have never heard of Dr. Wolfensberger. They're people with impairments. They're not people who go to workshops. They're not people who maybe read books. Okay? But there also are people whose lives have been affected by Dr. Wolfensberger's work, okay? In a way that, I guess I would be one, and I sort of sum that up by thinking back, remembering very vividly, more than one occasion, in which I was sitting in a lower seat and Dr. Wolfensberger was up here with projectors. And he said something that I then said to myself, he's talking to me. Okay? There's 95 people in the room, but he's talking to me. I better listen. I better listen as to, what does this mean for my work? What does this mean, for who I am even? Okay? He's talking to me. So impact in different ways, sometimes indirect, sometimes very direct, very personal. Okay? So we're gathered here to share reflections on Dr. Wolfensberger's immense indirect impact on whole fields, on people who never met him, on people who have never heard of him. But also to share our reflections on his very direct and exquisitely personal impact on who many of us have become.
There's a difference between remembering what a person did and remembering who a person was, though of course there's overlap. So for instance, if someone erects buildings, that's something the person does, but it also speaks to who the person is, an engineer, an architect, or a construction worker. But there are other aspects of who we are that may not correspond so directly with what we do. For instance, if a person is optimistic, that would be expressed in many different ways in what the person does. So I thought I would share with you a few thoughts about who Dr. Wolfensberger was, rather than what he did. More than any other person that I have ever known, Dr. Wolfensberger felt very heavily and very much as a burden the brokenness and imperfection of our humanity and our world. In simple terms, that an awful lot is wrong with us and with the world, and that it can't be fixed by humans. So driving down the street, he would see a dilapidated building, and he would sigh over its state of decay. And that would lead him to think about all the dilapidated or destroyed buildings that he had ever seen, and all the rundown buildings in the world, and that every building eventually would collapse, and he would sigh even more deeply. And we weren't allowed to sigh at the office, only he could sigh. And he hated to see anything useful go to waste, and he did his share, including making the rest of us take part in salvaging usefulness out of thrown away goods. But especially, he felt very heavily the imperfection of how we human beings relate to each other. Once, we were passing through an ordinary neighborhood at an ordinary time. It was a nice area, and the homes had welcoming appearances, and there was the glow of warm lights from indoors shining out through the windows into the darkness. And he said to me, "Thomas, don't be fooled. Behind each of these doors is the same dysfunctionality." He deeply understood human nature, its frailty, its great capacity for inflicting harm, and he knew that our social harmony and even our civilization were fragile, all things considered. Another characteristic of Dr. Wolfensberger's was his capacity and willingness to look ahead and to see what might or could happen. Someone said he had long eyes. Other people might also have the capacity to look ahead, but many fewer people have both the capacity and the willingness, because if you're willing to say that something gladly embraced today can and probably will lead to something unimaginably awful in the future, this brings great unpopularity. And few people are willing to endure that. And especially if your prediction or your prevision is vindicated, it may not come until long after, maybe not until after you're dead. And Dr. Wolfensberger said that always reduced the chances of enjoying the gratification of being able to say, I told you so. Dr. Wolfensberger was also a man of very deep faith ever since his childhood, a faith which guided what he did and which sustained him in his many troubles and hardships, and to which he looked for direction and strength and support. And by his own reckoning, this faith, well, of course, actually the God behind this faith, never failed him. One passage of the Bible in particular grew ever more important to him, and he cited it in several different teaching events and workshops that he conducted. It's from the book of Ezekiel. And the verses are, "The word of the Lord came to me, when the watchman blows the trumpet to warn the people, anyone hearing but not heeding the warning of the trumpet, and therefore slain by the sword, he shall be responsible for his own death. He heard the trumpet blast, yet refused to take warning. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and fails to blow the warning trumpet so that the sword comes and takes anyone, I will hold the watchman responsible for that person's death. I have appointed you watchmen for the house of Israel. When you hear me say anything, you shall warn them for me." Another thing, and the last thing that I want to mention about Dr. Wolfensberger, is that he believed in the power of thoughts and ideas, both good ones and bad ones, more than anything else. What people have in their minds, what they take into their minds, and very importantly, what they allow others to put into their minds, that determines who they'll be and what they will do, and very importantly, how they will relate to other people, including the lowliest people in the world. And he invested much in finding out what are good ideas and putting good ideas into the minds of the people that he came in contact with. So these features or characteristics of Dr. Wolfensberger's being help to explain a great deal of his legacy. For instance, they help to explain why he pursued reform of services to impaired people from the abysmal conditions when he entered the field in the late 1950s and 60s. And they also help to explain why he was not contented with the initial service reforms that he helped to create, but subsequently also critiqued them almost from the first moment that they were established. These things also help to explain why he continued to question, analyze, and even to rail against many things that appeared in society and on the service scene that were purported to be good for devalued people. Sometimes they were even promoted by some devalued group or their allies, but that he judged to be bad for them and for society. And in my opinion, these things also help to explain why he took on some of the most controversial topics when he could have rested on his laurels, and even when these controversial topics made him exceedingly unpopular and risked his reputation and even tainted his earlier accomplishments. For instance, these characteristics of who he was explain why he spoke out against the growing legitimized death-making of devalued people and the decline of our society, even though he himself judged it to be a losing battle. Well, I will close my few minutes by saying that Dr. Wolfensberger taught us that who we are is much more important for any of us than what we do. After all, as Dr. Wolfensberger saw about the nature of the world, everything we do eventually dies. Every building eventually collapses. And what we do may become very corrupted and degraded even before it dies. Even our successes may contain within them the germ of their own perversion. So to set a lot of store by what we accomplish or what we do is to set ourselves up for certain disappointment and even heartbreak. If, on the other hand, we concentrate on what kind of person we are, if we strive to seek the truth and to be faithful to it, to be compassionate and merciful and generous, these things, they are part of us, they last. And if we can be sustained by a childlike trust such as he had in a benevolent God who does not abandon us, we will be upheld through many disappointments and failures, through the never-ending tale of human against human rather than human for and with human, and we can die in peace. We thank Dr. Wolfensberger for that lesson. We thank the good Lord for having lent him to us for a short time. Thank you.
This may sound blasphemous, and since Susan's here, I'll keep it clean. But in the 1970s, in the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, at the Center for Human Policy at Syracuse University, there was a trinity of sorts. And first it was Dr. Burton Blatt, and I don't think any of us could ever forget Bert, who wrote and published the book that rocked the nation, called Christmas in Purgatory. An expose, as you know, of the conditions at Fernald State School. Unbelievable. The second person there was Dr. Gunnar Dibwad. All of you in Massachusetts know Gunnar. He was an adjunct professor at that time, along with Dr. Rosemary Dibwad. They ignited the international parents' rights and advocacy movement through their writings. They really did. They started it. So here's Bert talking about the man's inhumanity to man. There's Gunnar and Rosemary talking about the parents' right movement and advocacy. And also, you know, Gunnar was the first national director of the ARC, as you know. So, I mean, there those two were. Now, third, and I'm not saying who's the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. I'm just saying third. There was Wolf Wolfensberger, who wrote the seminal work, Normalization, work through its audaciousness. He was so audaciously clear. His audacity of clarity and insight challenged the human services world as we know it. And the story I remember going to Bert, and Bert said, there's somebody you have to meet, because I was going nuts at Syracuse, not getting what I wanted to get done. And he said, there is somebody who's coming down to Syracuse, and I'm going to send you to NIMR in Toronto for his first workshop. And you'll meet Dr. Wolfensberger, who is going to be there, and you are going to be his graduate assistant. I said, okay. But he said, the first thing you have to do is read this book. Normalization was how many pages, Susan? 6? Oh, was that all? It felt like thousands of pages. I don't care, it felt like thousands of pages, and had to go there and read the book. You know, the one thing about Bert and about Gunnar and about Wolf, and I will call him Wolf, because when I first met him, I was always Mrs. Shane. And then over the years, he finally relented and called me Christine. So one thing about Bert and about Wolf and about Gunnar is they did not always agree on strategy. They always had very often had very different interpretations and perspectives on what should be done, which frankly made my life so much more rich. It really did stimulate that issue about as interactions between human beings, what is best, what is not best, listening to different points of view, being not only organic, but being genetic and being energized by these three men. It was an amazing thing. But you know about Dr. Wolfensberger, he was German. He really was German by both birth and character. And he had, and when he emigrated to the United States at a young age, you know, he studied, as he said, at prestigious colleges, which he would say, and universities, and he earned his doctorate degree in psychology. He married a charming lady named Nancy, who, I'm sorry she's not with us today, but I know you'll send her our best regards. Raised and loved 3 children and was a devoted Christian. Despite his 60 or so years as a citizen, Wolf never shed his European accent and maintained and mixed it in with a bit of Midwestern twang. I never know how he did that, which he did pick up in Nebraska. You know, the other thing I have in my notes is that not only did he call me Mrs. Shane, but he had Mr. Yates, Mr. Webster, Mrs. Benville at that days. You know, he was wonderful. But, you know, he changed our lives through his writing and his work. He was a highly disciplined academic, a prolific writer in the areas of intellectual disability, sociology, and history. And that's the other thing that I loved about working with Wolf, is he combined these wonderful fields of history and sociology and dare I say the word, cognitive impairment or mental retardations. And he would pick up on the theme that Bert would always say. One thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And I can see those two speaking and talking. I have a wonderful picture of them together, you know, talking about these very wonderful parts of the human existence. He also did something else. He reinvented the language of human services to include the words normalization. He really did reinvent a language. How many of you had ever heard the term model coherency before you met Wolfensberger, right? You know, he did, and you think of that word social role valorization, citizen advocacy. And he also did something which was unbelievable, which it was like, yes. He would talk about the evaluation of human services, not based on somebody's accreditation standards, but how they reflected and treated human beings. And we still haven't learned from that lesson. We still haven't learned from that lesson, but he did that. He did it as one of the first. His ideas have run throughout this country and certainly throughout the world. As many of you are aware, we in Massachusetts are particularly grateful for his ideas and his teaching. For more than 35 years, Dr. Wolfensberger's workshops have been continuously conducted in Massachusetts. In 1976, former Assistant Commissioner Linda Glenn, a protege of Wolf Wolfensberger, began to implement the principles of normalization / social role valorization when the mass consent decree began on Belchertown State School. We're very lucky today, and I say this, it is important to acknowledge and support our commissioner, Elin Howe, and her administration as they continue to advance and put forth the pioneers of social change. And I did not know this, but Elin told me today that she knew Linda when she was at Willowbrook during the first consent decree, and that's when she had several interactions with Wolf. I'm so glad you're here. I am. Oh, okay, we can do that. This is from Jack Yates, and he gave me this quote, and I thought it was perfect. As William Faulkner said, "The past is not dead. It's not even past." Thus, the ideas of Dr. Wolfensberger and others will continue to bear fruit as people with impairments grow into value roles, as communities learn to welcome all of its members, and as we continue to struggle with the issues raised in services to others. I have to tell one story, though. When I was at Syracuse, I was pregnant with my first child and about to leave. And I was doing past workshops, and I'm out to here, and I'm doing past workshops. And Dr. Wolfensberger, at that time, he was still Dr. Wolfensberger. He said, "Mrs. Shane, what do you think you will name your child?" Now, my last name is Shane, beginning with an S. I said, "Well, what are you thinking, Wolf?" Dr. Wolfensberger. He said, "I'm thinking that we could do something that might be a little bit out of the unusual." I said, "You mean like naming her Patricia, Ann, Susan, Shane for pass?" And he said, "I hope you'll consider it." Thank you.
When my son Kevin was born 43 years ago, we were in Texas. I was absolutely stunned and terrified to learn that he was, as they put it then, not normal. The diagnosis of Down syndrome, with the high likelihood of severe mental retardation and ongoing anomalies of a medical nature, and the fact that he would have a very short lifespan, all of that was laid in front of us. And when I asked the doctors, well, what does a family do in this kind of a situation? One doctor actually said to me, "If you like him, you can take him home." Well, when I speak of Kevin, I always ask him if I can talk about him. And the reality was, I didn't even know him yet, and I wasn't sure I liked somebody that came with this baggage. So I set off trying to see what Kevin's options were. A visit to the state institution in Denton, Texas, the State School for the Feeble-Minded, 43 years ago. I still can't talk about it. So Kevin came home, whether we liked him or not, and I set about to see what I could do to fix this broken kid. That was my mindset at the time. So we did about every kind of therapy that you can think of on a poor little infant. Visiting at home at one point, my grandmother, who was a woman who had no more than a 6th grade education. And it was our first visit home, and I was trying to explain to her what was, quote, wrong with Kevin. And after my lengthy discussion about chromosome abnormalities, et cetera, she looked at me and she said, "Carolyn, he's a baby." Now, it took me many years and much experience to get back to that point. He was just a baby. Several years later, when Kevin was already in elementary school, I talked my way into a job at the staff training department of a Willowbrook-related facility. I needed a job. I knew something about mental retardation, and I had been trained as an adult educator. So that seemed like a good match, and they hired me. And one of my colleagues there had an unusual approach in how she dealt with the people who were served at that institution. It was in Howard Park in New York City. And in talking with her about what made her practice so different, she identified having gone to a PASS workshop. And I said to myself, I got to get me some of that as soon as I can. Well, the opportunity didn't present itself until I had moved here to Massachusetts. And I'm fond of saying that probably I'm the only person in Massachusetts who ever paid the full price for a PASS workshop. That's how eager I was to go. And so I went to the PASS workshop, and you're all expecting to hear what a wonderful and enlightening experience this was. But it wasn't. I was horrified. I was so bent out of shape by what was laid in front of me at that workshop. And literally, I mean, I almost left. I was so upset with them. But over a period of time, as I re-examined what had been shared in that workshop, I came to see another truth. Now, the concepts themselves were hard to deal with because they deal with really what is, for a lot of people in our society, and for myself at that time, actually unconscious. We don't think about the things that we do that separate people with disabilities from the rest of the world. We just don't think about it. But as a parent, it was horrifying to realize that those same feelings, ideas, and concepts of my own kid as other, they were part of me, and probably had already had some impact on my own child. So I'm here to say that Dr. Wolfensberger, his thoughts and his training institute and those who helped him operate that, did a horrible thing for me. They made me face a reality that was very hard to face. And that transformed my relationship with my own child and has really forever impacted my life. A short time ago in this very building, Dr. Wolfensberger was with us for a workshop that was labeled Personalism. I had no idea what that was. And I wasn't even sure I wanted to find out, but I came anyway. And again, I would tell you, the teaching is not fully embedded now in me. There were a few ideas that I took away from that, and maybe those will grow, and maybe with a little work I can grow a few more. But what I really took away from that workshop was seeing Dr. Wolfensberger, who was at that time not well. He appeared frail, but his spirit and his enthusiasm for those in front of him, those who had come from for the workshop, was extraordinary. And there was one moment when had been some discussion about dealing in a human service context with folks whose lifestyle might not be consistent with the values that were espoused at this workshop and that many people in the room held. And somebody said, Dr. Wolfensberger, what should the response be when I have to deal with these people? And Dr. Wolfensberger's response was immediate. He didn't have to think about it. He simply said, unconditional love, of course. Now, Dr. Wolfensberger's not known for being, touchy-feely and sentimental and lovey kind of guy. He's a pretty tough guy. But that is the foundation of the legacy he left us. And to have been present and to have received that message from his mouth is something that I will treasure. Thank you.
Earlier this week, I was talking to the pastor in our church about materialistic, individualistic, sensualistic, externalistic Heronowism. And I had to confess that I hadn't originated that conceptual framework myself. And so I referred to Dr. Wolfensberger as a person who's been a teacher to me. And for myself and for many others, I think he's been a teacher to us. So I thought I'd reflect a bit back on the years since I first went to a PASS workshop. I think it was in 1980. I don't have the kind of records that they have at the Training Institute to help me keep track of these things, Susan. And going to a first PASS workshop way back when, that Dr. Wolfensberger wasn't at was Michael Kendrick, who was the trainer there. And we talked about normalization, not social role valorization. And I learned about devaluation and about people being wounded out of that devaluation and about the vulnerability that persists in the lives of people in devalued status. And that was a new idea to me, I thought the problem up until then was disability, and I learned that the problem was actually devaluation, the major problem that we might do something about, and that just as a central understanding. And that was also, with normalization, offered a valid way of addressing, not solving that problem, but of addressing it. And I learned new words. I learned a lot of new words from Wolfensberger. One of them that I remember learning there at that first PASS workshop was deviancy image juxtaposition, something that I had actually not talked with people about before. And then I went to an advanced PASS workshop. I had that opportunity in the early 80s and learned more about how to analyze and understand what's going on in human services. And I guess at the same time I was learning about how to analyze and understand what's going on in other parts of life as well. And through participation in lots of rigorous analytical processes, I think I may have actually learned something about how to think. And I learned other things there. A main one that I came forward from that with was a deeper understanding of the universality of this devaluation across all times and places and cultures, and in all of us, and in all different, towards all different groups of people, not just in a theoretical sense, but from having heard about that with other people. So universality might be a word there, and that was leadership development. Wolfensberger was thinking back in the early 1980s about the importance of other people learning to do this teaching so that it wouldn't always have to be him. And then I went to passing. It was a new tool. It was clearer, less vulnerable to misuse. It was more rigorous. I learned a little bit more discipline to go to 2 site evaluations instead of just 1. And a word that occurs to me that emerged out of that is this resistance to being distorted or being confused was perversion. And that up until then I'd thought perversion was perversion. and that I learned that ideas and concepts can be perverted and corrupted and degenerated, but the word perversion sticks in my mind. And that was actually where I first saw Dr. Wolfensberger. Saw him a little bit at the advanced PASS workshop, but saw him in action, listening as we did this first dry run of a passing workshop, and further designing the tools. And it was right around that time another word emerged, which was social role valorization. And I looked up valorization in the dictionary, and it says something about price fixing in the marketplace, but I learned that was a different definition. I went to a moral coherency workshop just a few weeks after I got laid off from my job in state service. They'd had 1,402 employees at Belchertown State School, concluded they only needed 1,401, and that I personally was the extra. I took that personally. But at this workshop, I hope that I was laid off for good reason, for moral reason, because that was part of what the workshop was about, that if you try and be a moral human service actor on a systematic basis, that expect bad stuff to happen. So I hope it was for good reasons that I was laid off. I learned words there like rational moral analysis, applying these analytical skills to moral questions. And in a later version of this, I learned the word stoicheia. The stoicheia of one's morality, what's the source of it? Is it oneself or collective thing, products of human beings, collectivities of human beings, or is the source of our morality something from outside of the human beings? Stoicheia, again, was not a word that I had talked about before. I went to a Sanctity of Life workshop and learned about the reality of death-making there. Again, Wolfensberger is the primary teacher. Death-making and sanctity of life, death-making, a new word, that I'd heard before, but to come to understand. And certainly not something popular to teach, as has been said, but a fundamental issue facing all of us as human beings as far as how we treat each other, life and death. And not a popular topic. I became part of an SRV council and a moral coherency, a study group, and a Sanctity of Life salon. Many multi-year efforts that Dr. Wolfensberger was a major teacher and leader of other people who he was developing to carry on or to help carry on some of the teaching work. Again, he wanted to teach people, you see, things that they needed to learn. Maybe not the things that they always wanted to learn or wanted to hear, but he would look at people, and as a teacher, instead of saying, what would you like to know, he would say, what do I think you need to know? And he would teach us those things, and he worked with us. And then I went to a personalism workshop. The word that I have from that, was mentioned by Carolyn in this workshop, is entelechy, I think. Anybody know what that is, other than Susan? Entelechy is the nature of things. And it means that, you can hope for certain things out of human beings, but you better be aware of the reality of who and what we are as human beings, the nature of things. Again, another very important thing to know and understand so that we can have some hope of being realistic. Personally, I think of experiences where Dr. Wolfensberger said things that I think we needed to hear. One time I asked him to do a talk about the history of citizen advocacy in an evening at one of these moral coherency workshops. And I thought he'd say, well, I was at this conference in Pennsylvania, and tell a story. He starts off his talk saying, in the bones of the Neanderthals. We find evidence that people were looking after people with disabilities for many, many years, people who couldn't hunt and gather for themselves, and we could all be pretty sure that there was no Department of Social Services that was organizing the supports for those folks. I had the opportunity to have him edit one of the reports that I wrote. Any of you have ever had the experience of being edited by Dr. Wolfensberger? You know that the dread word reconceptualization means like totally take your ideas and organize them in a different way. And then let me know when you've done that. But again, you see, this is something I needed. It helps us to think more clearly and understand better and share better. On one occasion, we were at a meeting at the Massarelli-Tominski household, and someone had asked Dr. Wolfensberger to talk about how to pronounce German words. And he did an entire session with us on the derivation of all the Indo-European languages with maps and charts. And I assumed that Dr. Wolfensberger would tell us the things that we needed to know. On this occasion, I don't think he quite hit the mark. Except maybe it helped us to learn to understand and endure a little better. I talked to him about starting this group, Massachusetts Citizen Advocacy, many years ago. And, I was kind of pretty enthusiastic, and what he said is, it's an interesting experiment. And it put it in a framework for me of understanding that the times weren't really what they were back then, and that it was a worthy thing to try, but to remember that this wasn't starting out on some brand new exciting venture that people would join up and enlist in readily like it was at one point in time back in the 70s, but kind of be prepared. Again, I guess he told me what I needed to hear. I went to a workshop we had here. Dr. Wolfensberger, I went to a shorter version of it in Syracuse with my two sons about how to get by in a time of diminishing resources. And that in that particular time, Dr. Wolfensberger was there in Syracuse, and then we sponsored a full-day training session here that Dr. Wolfensberger didn't manage to get to. That was like a couple years ago in June, a year and a half ago, whatever. And we had like 100, or more than 100 people, a couple hundred people show up. And they all wanted to hear about, how can you get more money? And which is what they wanted to hear. And Dr. Wolfensberger talked about how there wasn't going to be more money, and what we needed to hear as far as how to make the best use and the most responsible use collectively on behalf of our brothers and sisters in need, how to make the best use of the resources that were there. So I guess he thought we needed to hear about realistic planning and not about how to be more clever in getting more than our share. So who was Dr. Wolfensberger? An insightful analyst and a creator of new ideas, or a vehicle for sharing important ideas that came to him from some other source. He was certainly a teacher, great teacher to me, certainly a word creator. And this model coherency idea he applied, I think, in his interaction with all of us, you see, that he thought about who are the people, who are we, and who is it that we stand by, and who is it that we support, and what is it that we need in order to be moral actors in the lives of our brothers and sisters with disabilities. And then he told us, courageously, unpopularly, insightfully, lovingly, but he was a teacher.
As I had the opportunity to meet and work with Wolf in the 1970s, I'm probably the oldest guy here around, but because of Brigitte, I still look, I think, a little bit younger than, but cosmetic surgery, I suppose. But I would like to share some of my thoughts regarding Wolf at that time of his life. And some of these thoughts may surprise you a little bit. I met Wolf in 1972 at what was called at that time the National Institute on Mental Retardation, called NIMR, in Toronto, Canada. Wolf was 37 years old. He has been invited there by his colleague, Dr. G. Allen Rohrer. Allen Rohrer was a sociologist and a guy coming from the province of Saskatchewan in Canada. And Saskatchewan is the birth of so-called socialism in Canada. And Allen invited Wolf to accomplish three things. First, to write his book, his famous book, The Principle of Normalization, that we heard about today. Two, to develop with Linda Glenn his new assessment tool, which will become, in 1975, PASS-3, with the support of the Institute students. That support was sometimes very complex because we argue a lot with Wolf at that time. And the Institute students, I was one of them. Some that you know here, Michael Kendrick, Bernie Graney, Christine. And third, to assist the Institute, so that was J. Allen Rohrer's idea, to develop two community services, one in English Canada, in Lethbridge, Alberta, and the other one in French Canada, in Sept-Îles, Quebec. Dr. Rohrer had received federal grants from the Canadian federal government, and it was the nature of federal politics at that time, has changed a little bit, I must tell you, that pilot projects had to be in both parts of Canada, one French, one English. And Wolf, who can read French, had some problems speaking with French Canadian because the French accent is quite different than what he was learned what he learned when he stayed in Alsace. So as you may know, Wolf was part of the development in eastern Nebraska in the late 60s of community services named ANCOR, which stands for Eastern Nebraska Community Office of Retardation, that were the first comprehensive community-based services for people with mental retardation, as they were labeled at that time. It was a landmark achievement, and we as members of parents' associations in Canada were literally flocking to eastern Nebraska to see what they had achieved. So Wolf was teaching us the quote-unquote the mechanics of community living, speaking of new concepts like chaining. I don't know if you ever heard that concept before, which was the link between the individual, the community, the agency, the regional government, the state government, and the federal government. It was complex and difficult to achieve, of course. But at that time, Wolf was a believer, and that may surprise you. Wolf was a believer, we're talking 72, that a benevolent state could really help its citizens, including its most vulnerable ones. You see, Wolf became an anarchist, but this is later on. Probably because of the influence of Susan, I suppose. I would say that Wolf, by the way, I just want to mention something that I'm sure Susan knows about, but when he was at the Institute, he stayed at the Institute from 71 to 73, the Institute in Toronto. And Wolf had decided there that he will come to Syracuse, New York. But he almost came to Boston because of his friendship with Burton Blatt. Could you imagine, if Wolf would have been in Boston for the last almost 40 years? It would have been, Boston would be totally different today. And anyway, so, I would say that Wolf in these days was a social democrat, the Scandinavian way, which explains, partially at least, is an in-depth study of normalization principles and their role in the development of services in the Scandinavian countries. In 1971, I was training for 8 months in Sweden and Denmark. And I heard a lot about Wolf there because Wolf had come, of course, to the Scandinavian countries before. He had, many contacts with Bengt Mikkelsen, Carl Grunwald in Sweden, and so on. And he had already made a very, very strong impression on them. And he was perceived by Bengt Mikkelsen and Carl Grunwald as a little bit the savior of what if something comes out, something good comes out of the huge institutions that we had both in Canada and the States. Wolf Wolfensberger will make a dent, will make something important. And so he raised a lot of hope over there about his role that, of course, he eventually played in North America. Also, Wolf was developing this new tool, which became in 1975 PAS-3. As for all of us who work closely with Wolf, we have our anecdotes. Let me tell you one, the funniest I had with Wolf. We were driving in the small roads, PAS-3s like, later on with passing. So we were driving the small roads of the Niagara Peninsula, tracking the services we had to evaluate. And of course, we finished late that night we had to come to our motel. So guess what happened? There were only a few rooms left at the motel. So I end up, that was not my choice, it happened like that. I ended up sharing a room with Wolf. I said to him that I will use the bathroom first, which was fine with him. And when I got out of the bathroom, Wolf had put on his bed the furniture, the carpet, hundreds and hundreds of these small cards, that we all had as students, Wolf, write things, on that and observe, During the traffic, when the traffic light was red, we had to make some observations. Did we see the chimney of the institution over there? What kind, is it in brick? What kind of color? Well, yeah, everything was, we had to document everything. So, so that we had collect during the day. So I said to Wolf, Wolf, where are you going to sleep? And there he answered, bubbling, that he needs to look at some of the data and prepare the next day. So I woke up a couple of hours later, and Wolf had put additional cards everywhere in the room, almost on my bed, actually, I had asked and woke up, this is a motel in Niagara Peninsula, woke up the concierge or whoever there to get an additional lamp in the room, and so on. So I felt, as a doctor, I said, well, I sermoned him a bit on the role of sleep and the new findings that we just had at that time about REM sleep. And, I was trained at Stanford University, so Bill Demmett was one of my teachers there. So, its necessity, REM sleep is absolutely necessary, 5 times a night. Obviously, this had no effect. And a few hours later, when I woke up, Wolf has just finished collecting his cards, the cards. So we went back for the second day. So 2 weeks later, I received a note from Wolf. Blanchet, there is an error on your explanation of REM sleep. It becomes necessary after 6 days of REM deprivation. So I don't think one night could have had an effect on me. So you could see that all the ingredients of this great man were already there when he was in his 30s, including his great sense of humor. Thank you very much, Dr. Wolfensberger.
As the years go by, there are 2 teachers in my life who their influence increases, even though now both of them are gone. One was my high school English teacher, Miss Janet Fine, who was formidable. And it was said about Miss Fine that after you graduated, this was a private girls' school, if you wrote her a letter and it had errors in it, she would correct it in red and send it back to you. And increasingly, Wolf is in her venerable company. And it's really the importance of his teaching has actually increased and deepened with age and experience, which is a great gift. I mean, that's the sign of a great teacher. I heard him at workshops. I loved the history workshop. And I have a collection of what he called the psycho postcards. And I think we should stay in touch in case we want to trade and show our collections. It's very precious to me. So I went to work at the Fernald State School in 1974. And before that, I was working for a private detective agency. And I am a great believer in the power of grace. And at the detective agency, a woman who came there to work was studying Rudolf Steiner, of all things. I don't know how she found this seedy detective agency, but one day she said to me, she looked me in the eye and she said, "We can't do this anymore." And she was right. It was pretty morally reprehensive work. So she and I went and applied to the Fernald State School. And she didn't wind up, this was a redemptive. So she didn't wind up staying, but I did. And in the service building at Fernald, and anybody who's been there knows this cavernous, vast building where most of the residents of the school would be brought to eat their meals. It was a huge building and echoed with the sound of, clanging metal trays and people's exclamations and sometimes screams and fights and whatnot. And there were usually birds flying around. It was that, vast. And a woman who I'd gotten to know was at another table with the folks she worked with, and she held up this book with a big red circle on it, and it was The Principle of Normalization. And I didn't read it, but I'll never forget that. To me, that was another occasion of grace, where something kind of broke into my consciousness and took a little while for me to kind of get it, being introduced to Pass and to Wolf. And, I particularly want to thank Christine Shane and Jack Yates for introducing me to this whole ideology and for really being the kind of disciples that taught me. Wolf's light was a little bit difficult to look at directly. He was a little intimidating, but I had these wonderful teachers. Jack's wife, Sandy, used to refer to us as the Gang of Three. So after Fernald, I worked there for 6 years, and over the years, increasingly, what has happened is that I understood that experience, which was full of occasions of grace, in a kind of Flannery O'Connor grace kind of way. Not the beautiful sunset necessarily, but very deeply changed me. I didn't recognize the changes so much until I looked at them later and continued to look at them in ever greater understanding because of the work that Wolf did and the great teachers that I had as part of this social role valorization movement. And also he and they introduced me to other people who changed my life. Jean Vanier, the Catholic Worker Movement, John McKnight, and Wendell Berry. And I just want to close with a couple of lines from a poem that Wendell Berry wrote called Healing. And I read this all the time. People are kind of tired of hearing it, but it reminds me of these teachings of Wolf's and how that directed me to the teachings of unsuspected teachers. He says, the teaching of unsuspected teachers belong to the task and are its hope. They are waiting, as they always have, beyond the edge of the light. And that has been my experience. Thank you.
Wolf dropped the idea of citizen advocacy down in Georgia 35 years ago, and the idea of personalism. And we have certainly been turning those stones for a long time there, and they still feel like really good stones to keep turning. Jack had asked to maybe reflect a little bit on the opportunities that Wolf had given us personally. And I guess the first thing I would say is that, you can be given opportunities, but you don't always take advantage of all of them. And so I'm sure that Wolf offered many, many, many more opportunities to me than this. But the two that I was able to take advantage of would be, one, Wolf did help me rethink my relationship to my family, and particularly to my parents. And so I would say one opportunity that Wolf gave me was the opportunity to become a better son. And I will appreciate that, of course, till the day I die, and probably I'll appreciate that more the closer I get to my death. And then the second opportunity Wolf gave me that I was able to pick up, because again, I'm sure he gave me many, many opportunities that I wasn't able to appreciate, but was to give me a useful role in my community. And I would say in the broadest sense of the word, the useful role has been to be a question asker. And the two questions, again, in the broadest sense of the word that I think, I've been blessed to ask would be, what can people come to mean to one another? And what can people come to mean to the common good? And these are, I think, the two questions that Wolf, in some way, asked in great detail and with great fervor, but to soften them a little bit what can people come to mean to one another, and what can people come to mean to the common good? And I do believe these are the great questions that Wolf has left with us. Thank you.
And I can recall some of the lessons taught during that particular training period, which caused me to reflect on my experiences, taking me back to when I was first stricken with polio at age 3. And I had been institutionalized from 1944 until 1947. At that time, I really did not realize that I was institutionalized or that I was any different than anyone else. And I didn't realize until I learned at this conference that I had been, in fact, devalued, because I was treated like, in some instances, a third or fourth class citizen. And I would just give you a couple of examples. When you have polio, you have scattered muscle weakness. And I can distinctly recall being about 4 years old that I had an accident and went to bed because I couldn't get out in time. And I can remember being restrained as a consequence, as a punishment. And then in realizing over the course of the training, I realized there were so many of us, children, because we had no advocates in those days. There was no Civil Rights Act, polio was considered a crawler's disease, in many parts of the world. There wasn't really the legislators today, and it wasn't really a popular until President Roosevelt got involved and drew attention to it. And I just felt that when I listened to Wolf talk the last time I was up here, just before he had passed away, I was so touched by his emotion and his conviction. He used to say not to be afraid, to go forth and to speak against injustice. And one of his catchphrases that I keep writing down, I keep remembering, and I teach to my children, and I say, one of these phrases that Wolf taught me, he said that the seductiveness of evil always presents benefits. And I was so moved by the opportunity of hearing him speak. And I just wanted to thank everyone here who's participating in this event to join me in memorizing Wolf. And he'll always have a special place in my heart, and my son Frankie Jr., who couldn't be here today, who was so touched by Wolf. And I just think that he inspires us to continue in this fight. And thank you again.
10 months ago, last January, I was part of a project to help the people of Buckland, Massachusetts, consider services for their elders. Buckland is a tiny little town. I'm telling you, there's people who are from Massachusetts who never heard of Buckland. It's a little place. So what I did was I interviewed elders in their homes. Everybody I interviewed was over the age of 85, and it was January. So the houses were hot. And I interviewed 6 elders, 6 different interviews. And the last one, at the end of the day, it was hot in these houses, and I was a bit tired, And so I have to say that last interview, I'm going through it, and I said to the elder woman there, I said, so what would make a difference in your services? And then I was prepared to just write down. And she said, what would make a difference? Is if my service workers could function with personal moral coherency in this dysfunctional human service world. She did. She said that to me. So I frankly wasn't sure whether I had dozed. And perhaps didn't hear it right. So I asked her again. I said, I'm sorry, would you repeat that, please? And she said, sure. She said, don't you think it would make a difference as if all the service workers could function with personal moral coherency? Because it is a dysfunctional human service world. So she said it. So I said, where did you get that exact phrasing? And she said, well, about 30 years ago in Holyoke, I heard about this workshop. I didn't actually attend it, but I'll never forget the title. So I thought to myself, talk about the influence of this man. All you had to do was hear the name of some of his workshops, and it would stick, you know? So I met Dr. Wolfensberger when I was 23 years old, so you can say that I grew up with him as an adult. I certainly grew up with him in my human service career. Wolfensberger was my teacher, my mentor, my friend, and Lord, I miss that man. There's two things that I want to tell you about him. The first thing was, and some people alluded to this today, but that he was a man of great faith. He was born and raised a Roman Catholic, and he was buried from the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, Roman Catholic Cathedral in Syracuse, New York, last February. He practiced his faith all of his life, but don't think for a moment that his was a static belief. His faith was alive, it was vibrant. When he became convinced as an adult of the truth of or the truth in Christianity is that it is in its nature nonviolent, that Jesus really meant it when he said, love your enemies, that it wasn't just a phrase. That was a hard-won position, the position of pacifism, especially for somebody who had lived through the Nazi oppression. It was tough. And it was very tough for somebody who was a self-proclaimed hawk during the Vietnam War. But here it was, right in front of him. And so he had to face that, and he was unafraid, really, to move himself to new positions or new beliefs when it became very clear that that was what was called for. He trusted his faith, let's put it that way. And he was inspired by Dorothy Day and Peter Moran, and their example of the Catholic worker mentioned by Wendy earlier, especially their commitment to Christian hospitality, radical, personalist-based hospitality, what one person can do for another. And Wolfensberger was a member of the Unity Kitchen-based community of the Catholic worker in Syracuse, New York for almost 40 years. And a lot of that time he spent helping that community in just prayerful discernment of what form their personalism should take in assisting the poor. When Dr. Wolfensberger started talking about the threats to the very lives of people who have been socially devalued, people with impairments and so on, it was his commitment to the least among us that buoyed him up despite harsh criticism and even ridicule. When he first started talking about that, he became pariah in many, many ways, you know. And all of that came from a vibrant living faith. His commitment to devalued people grew from it, and his courage in suffering was born of it, because the last 2 years of Dr. Wolfensberger's life were very difficult in terms of his illness, I will say. And he had other kinds of sufferings in his life too. But it was his conviction and belief in the promises of Christ, as he would put it, that just blossomed and blossomed, nonetheless, in his suffering, he would put it. So about a year ago, Dr. Wolfensberger asked me to stop asking him, how are you doing? I'd say, hello, Wolf, you know, how's it going? How are you doing? And about a year ago, or the last year of his life, he said, please stop asking me how I am doing, Massarelli. I wasn't Ms. Massarelli, I was just Massarelli to Dr. Wolfensberger. And I think he loved to roll the R's. Anyway, he said, please stop asking me how are you? And I think that made sense because he knew that I knew how he was, and it wasn't good. And it would be hard to have to say so all the time, and it would be even harder to have to pretend that things were not as they are, you know? So he just said, just don't ask me. So I did my best, but that's a hard habit to give up. It just follows hello. Hello, how are you? So one time I messed up and I said, how are you doing, Wolf? And he was cross with me. He lost his patience with me, and he said, I asked you not to say that. And so I got cross back, and I said, well, what do you want me to say? And he pondered that. And we kind of worked out what we would say. And what we came up with was peace and blessings. So I'd call him up on the phone and I'd say, peace and blessings, Dr. Wolfensberger. Or I'd see him and I'd say, peace and blessings, Dr. Wolfensberger, or Wolf. And he would say, and also with you, Massarelli. So I want to tell you that there was great peace and many blessings, despite, again, hardship. Just as he believed, and just as he was promised, you know, that peace and blessings came through. Well, that was one thing I wanted to tell you about his faith. The other thing I wanted to tell you was Dr. Wolfensberger loved fun, what he would call merrymaking. That's what he loved. He would play these games. It was amazing how nimble his mind was, and he could just make up these games. One time we were in a very crowded city in Melbourne, Australia. A lot of people on the street, a lot of people coming and going. And he said, Massarelli, he said, let's imagine if these people walking by us lived in the 14th century, what they would do for a living. So I'm thinking, okay. And so this one stocky guy walked by and he said, brewer. And this teenage girl walked by and he said, harlot. And, you know, somebody else, monk. And it was amazing, this game that he would play. But anyway, he loved to have fun. And it's true to say that he loved music, because there were all these, you know, he loved dinner parties. He saw that, it, by the way, is an important part of change agentry, getting people together in a convivial atmosphere so they could chat, you know, which is why we wanted to offer that little reception afterwards. But so he loved fun. He loved music, but it's even truer to say that he loved song. Wolf Wolfensberger knew more songs than anyone I know. He had a song for every occasion. Now, a lot of them were in German, but he would have had a song for us today. I know he would have. And one time he was at our house for dinner, and I served ham for dinner. And I put the platter of ham down in front of him, and he said, oh, he said, we can sing the pork-eating song. Schweinefleisch. And there's a pork-eating song, and Wolf knew it, right? So anyway, what I want to do today to close this part of the program is I want to tell you about one of Dr. Wolfensberger's favorite songs. This song, it's an old German tune. The name of the song is Die Gedanken sind frei. Thoughts are free is what it means. It's an old German tune. Singing this song was banned by the Nazis. If you were caught singing this song, it could get you incarcerated, and then Lord knows what would happen to you. So it's a song that meant a lot to him. He loved this song, and we would sing it on many occasions. So wouldn't it be great if we all sang it today for Dr. Wolfensberger? My thoughts will not cater to Duke or dictator, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no scholar can map them, no hunter can trap them, no man can deny.
Die Gedanken sind frei.